Right, okay, so hello everybody, and thank you for coming to my talk. Now, the subject of this talk is very much designed around the inscription on the Sun Monument here at Wentworth Castle Garden. So it's about Lady Mary Wortley Montagu and the introduction of inoculation against smallpox from Turkey into Britain. And it's also going to be looking at why William Wentworth dedicated the Sun Monument to Lady Mary. So my aim with this talk is really to convey to you the significance of Mary's pioneering achievement in terms of both as a woman in introducing a medical innovation into a patriarchal society, and also the significance of her role in preventative medicine in the 18th century and also today. So the structure of the talk is I'm going to start by introducing the Sun Monument and talking about its historical significance. And then I'm going to come to the main body of the talk, which is about the remarkable life of Lady Mary. I'm going to concentrate on her early life, her notoriety, her travels, and her introduction of inoculation. Then I'm going to come back to Wentworth and look at the Wentworth connection. Why did William Wentworth dedicate the Sun Monument to Lady Mary? I'm going to try and answer that question. And then I'm going to ask the question, why remember Lady Mary? Why remember her at all? Why remember her now? And why remember her at Wentworth Castle Gardens? And then finally, I'm going to review the aims that I've just mentioned. Okay, so first slide, please, Ruth. So this first slide is of the Sun Monument set beautifully within the landscape at Wentworth Castles on a sunny day. So as you can see, we have an elegant obelisk topped by a golden globe and not one but two inscriptions. So what do we know? Well, we know this was erected around about 1746 by William Wentworth, who's now the second Earl of Strafford. And it's a copy of an obelisk he saw on his grand tour to Italy in his 20s. Now, if you look towards the top of the obelisk, you can see a golden globe, and this globe represents the sun. It gives the Sun Monument its name. And the sun is the symbol of the Enlightenment movement. Now, what was that? Well, it was a pan-European and North American intellectual movement which valued the ability to reason above all others. The 18th century is sometimes referred to as the Age of Reason. So one of the ideas of the Enlightenment was that through close observation of nature, one could gain an understanding of it. And through understanding nature, one could order it and gain control of it to the benefit of mankind. So this movement was very much inspired by Isaac Newton and his experiments in the 1600s. Now, it's important to understand that in the 18th century, reason was seen to be a quality of men only. It was not attributed to women. It was not valued in women. Therefore, it's most unusual that William Wentworth decided to dedicate the Sun Monument to Mary, to a woman, but he did. So let me read the dedication to you, which is believed to be from 1762. And it says, "To the memory of the Right Honourable Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who in 1720 introduced inoculation of the smallpox from Turkey into England." Now, there's an obvious mistake there that inoculation was introduced in 1721, not 1720. But I think we can forgive William Wentworth for that because of the historical significance of this monument. It's the first monument to a non-royal woman in Britain, and because of the association with the sun at the top and the inscription at the bottom, it is the first monument to the social achievement and intellectual achievement of a woman in Britain. So on to the main body of my talk. Who is this woman who William Wentworth has singled out for praise? Ruth, if we could show the picture of Lady Mary. It's a portrait coming up. It's of Lady Mary in Turkish dress. And it's from the 19th century, this particular painting, very colourful. So Lady Mary has been described by a contemporary of hers and also as her main biographer as the comet of the Enlightenment. And I think this is a really good description of Mary, because she was someone who shone brightly throughout her whole life, someone that you really couldn't ignore. She was often misunderstood. She inspired debate, and she was a controversial presence. And also, like a comet, hopefully she'll be remembered for centuries to come. So Lady Mary, she was born in 1689 as Mary Pierpont in Nottinghamshire, and she was born to the highest nobility of the land. Her family had privilege, they had wealth, they had rank, they had power. And her father moved his way through the ranks, really. He started off as an MP, then became a Lord, Duke of Kingston upon Hull, then Marquis of Dorchester, and apparently he had the ear of the king, so he was an influential chap. Now, Mary was very proud of her noble ancestry. They were a family of achievers, of writers, of politicians, and these qualities definitely seemed to run in the blood when it came to Mary. She identified as a writer throughout her adult life, and she certainly was outspoken. Now, her early life was touched by tragedy. She was the eldest of 4 siblings, but by the time she was 3, her mother had died, and she moved a long way from Nottinghamshire, from her home, to Wiltshire to live in a place called Westdean with her maternal grandmother. But at the age of 10, her grandmother also died, and she moved back to Thoresby Hall, which is the family estate in Nottinghamshire. And this was a very significant time for Mary, because it was here within the library at Thoresby Hall that she educated herself. Now, apparently, members of the household thought she was in the library reading romantic novels, and maybe she was some of the time, but significantly, she taught herself Latin. She taught herself to read it, and this would give her access to knowledge which would have been denied to her, because women's education in the 18th century, the early 18th century, was all about perfecting the art of domesticity in order to be a wife, in order to be a mother. And for someone of Mary's class, it was also about adding refinement to menfolk and their lives. So there's a anecdote about Lady Mary being sent on a course. Well, somebody came to Thoresby Hall for a month to tutor in the art of carving a roast beef. And the idea of this is that she would add refinement to a dinner party, but she would not have been allowed to join the men at the dinner table. She would not have been able to discuss matters of the day. In the early 18th century and beyond, women were banned from going to university, and they were banned from entering professions. Mary stated that she felt that she had stolen her education. She recognised that she was not entitled to it, but it did not stop her taking it anyway. So moving on, the first notorious act really in Mary's life is in 1712, when she's 23, when she elopes with MP Edward Wortley Montagu. Now, I've read some of the letters, and it's very clear that Mary doesn't love Edward, but she's in love with the idea of love. She does have a romantic soul, and she wants to please him. And as for Edward, he comes across as a very possessive person, very jealous, very critical of the attention she draws. And I'm sort of reminded of Aesop's fable about the dog in the manger. You know, he doesn't actually want Mary for all her qualities, but he really wants to stop anybody else having her. It's a curious choice for both of them, really. But Mary's strong-minded, and she knows what she doesn't want, and she does not want to marry Clotworthy Skeffington, who is an Irish peer who her father has lined up for her to marry. And it's only a few days before the marriage is due. Her father's already paid for the wedding outfit, that Edward comes in the middle of the night, and they flit away to Salisbury to get married. And this is a very reckless act for Mary, because she has no financial settlement. She really is at the whims of Edward. And I'm sad to say that within 2 weeks, she finds herself pregnant, and she's abandoned. Edward has gone off to tend to his mining interests in the northeast in his constituency. And Mary writes him many, many letters, and he doesn't reply to her. And Mary, it's at this time that Mary tours Yorkshire, she tours Cambridgeshire. She's trying to get to know her in-laws and make a good impression. And come 1713, she'd given birth to her first child, a son, also called Edward. Now, her celebrity really starts to begin in 1714. Edward has got a job at the Treasury in London, and Mary enters the court of the new Hanoverian King George I. Now, she's a very beautiful woman. She's very witty. She gains celebrity status. She also starts to move in a literary circle. She meets her great friend and adversary, poet Alexander Pope, and she begins to publish her work, but anonymously, and her work causes scandal. Now, in December 1715, Mary gets smallpox. And I'm going to sidestep from talking about her life a bit to discuss smallpox, because obviously we're talking about the introduction of preventative medicine. So I think we need to appreciate how hideous a disease this was. So Ruth, if you could show the photo of a young man going through the 4 stages of smallpox. So let's have a look. So you can see on the top left, this is him in this young man in the early stages of smallpox. He will have fever, he will be aching all over his body, he will have diarrhea and vomiting. Now moving to the right, we can see the liquid-filled pustules that are gathering on the hot places on his body. A sufferer of smallpox can have up to 10,000 pustules on their body. They get into your eye sockets, into the membranes of your nose, mouth, sexual organs. Very uncomfortable indeed. Now moving down to the bottom left, the pus becomes more opaque. The pustules can be itchy to the point of madness. Fever returns, and you're really at the crisis point of your disease. And then the final stage, the 4th photograph, scabs are formed, then they've fallen off, and scarring often ensues. So a few statistics about smallpox in the 18th century. Well, it was an endemic disease. It was ever present. It frequently became epidemic. It killed 1 in 4 of those who suffered from it. It caused 30% of blindness, significant disfigurement, but whoever had had smallpox was then immune to the disease for the rest of their life. And it was also a universal disease, much like we might expect to get the common cold in the 21st century. People would have known that at some point their lives would have been touched from smallpox. So they really did live in fear. And I've got a quote here from the historian Thomas Macaulay from 1848, who describes that fear. And this is it. He says, "The smallpox was always present, filling the churchyards with corpses, tormenting with constant fear all whom it had not yet stricken, leaving on those whose life it spared hideous traces of its power, turning the babe into a changeling, and making the eyes and cheeks of the betrothed an object of horror to the lover. There was no cure." Mary survived, but she was terribly scarred. She lost her beauty, she lost her place at the royal court, she lost her famous eyebrows and eyelashes, and she had problems with her vision for the rest of her life. She couldn't tolerate bright light. However, fate took a hand to the benefit of us all when Edward Wortley Montagu is offered the position as ambassador to go to Constantinople in Turkey. Now, Mary loves to travel and she's very keen to see the world, but travel is very hard work. There are rutted roads. Mary writes about traveling through battlefields and all that. She also has a toddler in tow. It must have been hell, but Mary is made of sterner stuff. And to me, she is the consummate travel correspondent. She's very curious, she's open-minded, she's very happy to dress up in local garb to get into those places that she's interested to see. She's an excellent linguist. She teaches herself the local languages. She's able to converse with local people, and she reads the Quran. And she writes long and narrative letters home describing Eastern culture. And only after her death, this book was published. It's called, I don't know if you can see, Embassy Letters, Turkish Embassy Letters. So we know what she got up to. It's all in that book. Okay, so one of the things that Mary does is she enters the female-only spaces. And if Ruth, if you could show the picture of the Turkish bathhouse. So this is one of the places that Mary goes into. I don't know if we're getting the picture up here, but she enters the bathhouse. There are many naked women within, and she has a chance to see their skin on their bodies. And she notices the women are not blemished and disfigured as she was. And she asks the essential question. She asks, do you not have smallpox in Turkey? And the answer she was given was, yes, we do have smallpox, but it's not a problem due to inoculation. So this is really the point where Mary discovers inoculation, and I think it must have been absolutely miraculous for her, because her brother died in 1713 of the disease. Her life is ever changed because of it, and she fears for her children, and she decides to investigate inoculation while she's in Turkey. And she goes to a demonstration, and I'm going to give you a little demonstration. It's a bit silly, this bit, but I just wanted to show you how simple Turkish inoculation is. So here we have, well, it's mustard actually, but it would be mild smallpox matters. So this would come from a pustule of somebody who'd actually had mild smallpox. So what they used to do, an old woman from the community used to come on with a long needle, and Mary's described this as in letters. This is exactly what they did. They dip the head of the needle in the smallpox pus as much as would hold on the top of a needle, and they would just do a very simple scratch on the arm. You didn't even need to get to the blood, you just need to scratch the surface of the skin, and then they used to cover it up with a little bit of nut. I'm just going to take that off my arm, but that was as simple as Turkish inoculation was. So after seeing the demonstration, Mary wrote home to her childhood friend Sarah Chiswell, and she said, I am patriot enough to bring this useful invention into fashion in England. And she so believes in it that before her and her husband leave Turkey, she has her son Edward inoculated by an old woman, according to folklore tradition, and he's also inoculated again at the same time by a surgeon called Charles Maitland, who's travelled to Turkey with the Wortley Montagus. So unfortunately, Edward Wortley Montagu wasn't much of a success in Turkey, and he's sent back, and Mary arrives back in England with her second child, also called Mary, in 1719. Now, she bides her time. She can't introduce inoculation immediately because she's involved in a financial and romantic scandal. How Mary? But in 1721, there's a smallpox epidemic in London. 3 of Mary's friends have died, and she wants to protect her own 3-year-old daughter, Mary. And she sees this as the opportunity to also demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of this procedure if she can. Now, Mary is a very pragmatic and very socially aware woman. She knows that if she, as a woman, is seen to introduce a scientific intervention, it is unlikely to be taken seriously because women can't reason, because women are not educated. And also, Mary's aware that a physician called Emmanuel Timoney wrote a letter to the Royal Society in London about the same Turkish inoculation procedure she'd witnessed 7 years previously in 1714, but they dismissed it as good for a pleasant shiver of curiosity at the bizarre and backwards practices of the East, but no more. So Mary knew that she had to counter prejudice on 2 fronts, both sexism and racism. So she used her powers of persuasion and perseverance to influence the men in her circle to promote the technique on her behalf, starting with her reluctant surgeon, Charles Maitland. So Ruth, if you could show a picture of the first inoculation. Right, so this is a famous portrait of Lady Mary holding young Mary, and she is being inoculated by Charles Maitland, and there's another physician kind of looking on. Okay, so the inoculation experiments were done in front of the Royal College of Physicians, including the King's doctor, Hans Sloane. So they would witness the inoculation and Lady Mary's progress during the 3 weeks of her recovery. Young Mary survived with only mild symptoms of smallpox and no scarring. So this is the first use of inoculation of preventative medicine in Western Europe. Now, Princess Caroline, who is George I's daughter-in-law, her daughter has recently had severe smallpox, only just survived, and she wants to protect her other children. So Mary and Caroline hatch a plan, and they asked for King George I to petition to have 6 condemned prisoners at Newgate inoculated. And in return, they will be spared the rope and given a royal pardon. So 6 prisoners are duly inoculated. They all survive with mild symptoms. But the question arises, does inoculation confer immunity against natural smallpox? So one of the women who's been inoculated, she is sent to Hertfordshire to spend 14 nights with a 10-year-old boy who's got severe natural smallpox. Does she get smallpox? No, she doesn't. So that strengthens the argument that inoculation confers immunity against natural smallpox. Now, Princess Caroline is still keen to inoculate her children, but she's not going to base her decision on an experiment done on prisoners. They're not like her. So they ask for more experiments, and this time they're done on orphans, on foundlings, the city of Westminster. So a terrible medical efforts going on here, but this is enough for Mary. She's convinced. In 1722, for Caroline, in 1722, she inoculates her 2 daughters and then her son. And after that, after royal endorsement, inoculation spreads like wildfire amongst the nobility of the land, including, in time, our very own William Wentworth. Now, there are still skeptics against this procedure. One of the arguments is that inoculation is against God's plan. It's meddling with God's providence. But another one that I'm going to read to you here from Dr. William Wagstaff really kind of encompasses the argument against. And he said, posterity will perhaps scarcely be brought to believe that an experiment practiced by a few ignorant women amongst an illiterate and unthinking people should, on slender experience, obtain to the most learned and polite nation in the world as to be received into the royal palace. So I think that tells us a lot about society in the 18th century, and racism raising its ugly head again. But that quote also highlights Enlightenment sentiments. Where's the proof? Where's the proof that inoculation really works for the masses? So where does this leave Mary? Well, word is out. They realised that it was her that was behind inoculation all the time. And was she praised? Well, listen to this. This is from Isabel Grundy, who's one of the biographers of Lady Mary, and she said, published attacks sounded clamorously through all the years of her direct involvement and beyond. Face-to-face hostility met her on her many visits, blatant from her equals, covert from servants. Even in the street, she encountered people taught to hoot at her as an unnatural mother who had risked the life of her own children. So a lot of criticism coming Mary's way. Praise did come at the end, more towards the end of her life, actually. But even then, she was credited with showing masculine intelligence. They couldn't see her intelligence as being a feminine attribute. Or she was praised for preserving beauty rather than saving lives, as Edward Jenner was when he introduced vaccination. And I'm afraid to say that Mary had many regrets about her involvement in inoculation. Her daughter, Mary the First Inoculated, was hounded throughout her whole life. People wanted to prod her and see, what had happened to her, how she turned out. But the main reason that Mary regretted her involvement is the physicians who'd observed these experiments decided not to adopt the simple Turkish inoculation procedure that I demonstrated to you, but they incorporated it into a costly, complex, lengthy practice, humoral medical practice of the day. So it was only for the rich, really until about the 1760s, and then it was popularised amongst the rural poor, but it was not for the masses until after Jeddah in 1796. And there's another great quote here which really sums it up, which says, as a medical pioneer, Mary was locked into interdependence with the professionals. In professionalising her discovery, they spoilt it. She won the battle but lost her campaign. The war was won at last, but not in her lifetime. And I think when they talk about winning the war, maybe we're talking about the eventual eradication of smallpox in the 1980s. So what does Mary do? Well, she moves to Italy in 1739, and she only comes back to Britain a few months before her death in 1762. So moving on to the question, why did William dedicate the Sun Monument to Mary in 1762? Well, there's a few theories, and I'll tell you what we know. Well, we know that William Wentworth was inoculated as a child. Maybe he was grateful, that maybe he thought that procedure had saved his life. We know that he met Mary on his grand tour. Maybe he was impressed by her. They also would have moved in similar circles when they went down to Twickenham for the season. Maybe he was an enlightened man. You know, it's possible that he saw the intelligence of Mary and wanted to thank her for introducing the procedure. But I think to look for the most likely reasons, we need to look at familiar themes within the landscaping at Wentworth Castle Gardens. So we know that the landscaping shows covert political support for the Stuart monarchy and the Jacobite cause. We see this in the Union Jack Garden, see it in the Queen Anne monument in the estate. We also know that the Wentworths like to celebrate marriage alliances within the estate, and you can see that in the Duke of Argyll monument. And we also know they like to one-up the Watson Wentworths at Wentworth Woodhouse estate to the southeast of here. So I think when we look at the Sun Monument, you can see the covert political message. One monarch, Mary II, and 4 Stuart heirs lost their lives to smallpox. So maybe in the dedication, William is commenting on the legitimacy of the Hanoverian monarchy, maybe wistfully looking at what could have happened to the Stuart monarchy if inoculation had been introduced earlier. And the second reason is due to a marriage alliance. The Wentworths and the Wortley Montagus were kind of tenuous in-laws. They were both married into the families of the Dukes and Earls of Argyll and Bute. And the date of the dedication in 1762, I think, is key, because in this date, Mary Jr., the first inoculee, and the Earl of Bute had moved into, well, had inherited Wortley Hall. They're now in-laws and their neighbours. And in 1762, Mary dies. The Earl of Bute becomes the first Tory Prime Minister. Now, as you may know, the Wentworths were Tories. The Wentworth Watsons were Whigs. So they now have an influential Tory neighbour and in-law. So I think William Wentworth dedicated the Sun Monument to Lady Bute's famous mother, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, for all those reasons. For such a simple looking obelisk, it's absolutely full of meaning and intrigue. And if also the year of Mary's death, this book that I showed you earlier, the Embassy Letters, was published, which reinvigorated public interest in Mary. So why remember Lady Mary? Why remember her at all? Why remember her now? And why remember her at Wentworth Castle Gardens? Well, first of all, why to remember her at all? Well, preventative medicine in Western Europe began with Mary's pioneering mission. She made it happen by countering prejudice. I think the success of the inoculation movement is much understood, and it's unfair to compare it to the success of vaccination. There would have been no Edward Jenner without Mary, in my opinion. And also, too few women are remembered to science or to the early 18th century at all. And I think by remembering her, we can counter discrimination in history today. Why remember her now? Well, it's the 300-year anniversary of the introduction of inoculation in April 2021, and the contemporary relevance could not be greater. We are living amongst a global pandemic and a time of mass inoculations. You know, all the stars are aligned to remember her now. So why remember her here at Wentworth Castle Gardens? Well, the simple answer is we've got the Sun Monument, lucky us, which celebrates her achievement. And Mary is a difficult person to place, really, because as a traveller, she never really lived in one place long enough to have an estate where she can be remembered. She is remembered in feminist literature, but it doesn't really go beyond that. So I kind of looked a bit further to think, well, why should we remember Wentworth Castle Gardens? Does it fit in within the kind of ethos of this estate? And obviously, National Trust works in partnership with the Northern College, Barnsley Museums. And I think it's interesting that the Northern College believes in providing education for people who found it difficult to access throughout their lives. Now, wasn't this true of Mary? Wasn't this true of early 18th century women? And I think in the spirit of equality and inclusion, remembering Mary can inspire those who face barriers themselves to education, and also inspire women in science where they're still underrepresented. And also, I know that the National Trust, or I believe the National Trust, wishes to present history to those who feel it really isn't for them. And I feel that the true legacy of Mary runs in the blood of anyone alive today because their ancestors were inoculated or vaccinated. You know, it's 12 generations of 300 years between inoculation being introduced and us. It's very likely that one of our ancestors is alive today because they were vaccinated. Okay, so I'm just going to readdress my aims I mentioned at the start of the talk. So I hope you can see that Mary is a significant figure as a woman because she faced prejudice and inoculation as an Oriental folk practice also countered opposition because of its Eastern roots. And I think Mary's contribution is significant because she offered her own child to be inoculated. She's very courageous, that first step. And through her pragmatism and perseverance and persuasion, inoculation was introduced into Britain and Western Europe. And I hope through my talk I did about smallpox, the severity of smallpox, you can see that by inoculation being introduced, some people could then choose to save their own life or that of their child. It's very significant at the time. Obviously, it led to the eventual eradication of smallpox in 1980, the greatest killer of all time, killing 500 million globally in the 20th century alone. So I believe Mary is significant to medical history as a pioneer. She's significant to women's history. She's significant to all history. And to some people, maybe all of us, we owe this woman our lives. Thank you.